Let me ask a question about funding. Almost all of the clients we work with are fundraising. They're all very early stage. They're all working oftentimes with venture capital investors for the first time. How should an investor think about the value of having patents when it comes to working with investors? Do investors see it as a significant plus? I mean, I've often thought of it as, if you have it, then you may be forced to assert it. And if you're forced to assert it, you may get it invalidated. So where does the value really fall out on a patent that's maybe been filed for, untested, maybe even unissued, when you think of it in the eyes of how an investor thinks about that value?
Right. So there's a few questions in there, Ryan, so I'm going to try to unpack that a little bit. Oftentimes, when a startup gets started, you're really only going to file a few patent applications directed to your most important core inventions. That's often the core and the basis of what the company's products and or services are going to be based on. Those important core patents are part of what will be left over in the potential occasion that your company fails. So thinking about it from the investor's perspective, you're investing a whole lot of money. There is a risk that a company will fail. That risk is fairly high when you look at the percentage of companies that fail, which is somewhere in the, I understand it's a high 90%. So you thinking like the investor, what do you have left when the business failed, either due to marketing or inability to actually complete the technology, inability to deploy the technology, whatever the reason may have been? Oftentimes, the employees, after they're all gone, and if the equipment was all rented, and what's left at the end of the day that you can try to extract some value from, it's really the patents and the patent application filings. Now, obviously, there's no guarantee that by the time your company is closing down, that you will actually have some patents that have issued off of the applications that you filed. However, all of those applications that you filed, they have some potential value, right? And it's not just about the patents that issue. There's also the potential for mining those applications. So, for example, if you filed a really strong patent application that described the entire breadth of not only the core thing that your company is focusing on actually building and delivering to the marketplace in 1.5 years from now, but if you start really thinking more broadly about what might your company do to extend that product, extend the feature set, think about what might you be doing in 10 years from now, and include all of that description. As long as you're able to describe it at a level of detail where someone else could then go and build that, you should be able to really capture a broad array or range of the potential inventions off of that original core invention that will help to really increase the value of that patent application filing. You can imagine that maybe the investor and some other folks who are involved realize that that business model was not optimal, or maybe the product or service wasn't quite right. So they may try to tweak it and do something slightly different, or they may simply sell the IP to someone else who's interested in taking those patent applications, mining the parts that are of value to them, which may be slightly different than what you're focusing on, and then using the power of those patents to go and build a company.
Something that has come up with our groups quite a bit, because generally our clients tend to have very, very few people in the company. They're very early stage. And I think they have a tendency, when there is something that they want to file a patent around, to list everybody in the company as an inventor. How do you see that, and what do you recommend when it comes to listing inventors on a patent application?
Right. So listing the inventors on a patent application, that's not the right time to have a team building exercise. There's actually a legal standard and a legal definition of who should be named as an inventor on a patent application. And it's really, really important to get that exactly right so that you're including everyone who should be included, and you're not excluding anyone who should be included. This can come into play, for example, if you hired temporary workers, contractors, grad students to help out with your product and building it. And maybe you decide let's not include so-and-so on this patent application. So the legal standard for inventorship is it's everyone who contributed to the conception of the ideas that are being claimed in the patent application. So one complication here is that it has a reference to the patent claims. So the claims are different than the specification and figures, which are relatively similar to any sort of technical specification that a lot of entrepreneurs are very familiar with. This isn't just about describing your invention. The claims actually define the metes and bounds of your legal rights in terms of blocking others, preventing others from practicing or making your invention. So once those claims are drafted, and that's ideally done with the help of an attorney because the claims are legalese. They're not just technical description again. So once your attorney has helped you to craft your claims, it's important to take a look at the claims and then have the inventors, whoever is currently thought of as being inventors, people who contributed to the ideas. It's important to have those people look through the claims and really think about, well, who contributed that idea and who contributed that idea? And just walk through the claims and really think about who came up with the ideas. It's not about who built the concepts. It could be that one guy came up with all the ideas, but then the entire team worked on building the product. That does not mean you include the entire team. It is just the one guy who came up with all the ideas described in the claims.
What happens if there are people that are listed on the patent that ultimately shouldn't be? What's the harm, I guess?
Sure. So the harm is that if your list of inventors is not correct, if it includes people that it shouldn't, if it dropped people that it should not have dropped, then that can be the foundation for invalidating your patent later on. You know, when you're at the point where there's a competitor who's worth suing because their market capitalization has gone to a certain point, or they're starting to eat into your market, and you decide this is the right time when I'm going to go, assert my patent to make sure that they back off. That's the point when attorneys from the other side will start to look at your patent and start to see where they can poke holes. If it goes into litigation and they start to get discovery on all of your documents and they discover any casual comments, any messages exchanged between people that seem to indicate that the list of inventors is wrong, they can now go use that as the basis for invalidating your patent. And that's complete invalidation of the entire patent. So you can see it's a pretty severe consequence.
Okay. I'm kind of throwing out this a little bit. Yeah, I don't think this is a loaded question, but what is a patent troll?
Patent troll. So that term is often used for someone, an entity or a person who doesn't actually make the invention, doesn't actually practice the invention, but is simply trying to find other companies who are practicing, making, selling the invention, and then goes and tries to sue those other companies. There are a lot of different ways to look at this, and there's a lot of different circumstances. I will tell you, I had one client before who was a non-practicing entity, as they're sometimes also called. He had come up with these great ideas, he had patented them, and he was spent all of his time doing heart surgery for free for the poor and destitute. And he was counting on making a living from licensing his patents. And so he, is one example where he actually invented it himself. He was the actual original innovator, and he came up with these great ideas. And, they're very useful ideas. And so they were being incorporated into some products. On the other hand, you also have other situations where there are companies out there that will look for what they think are really good, valuable patents, and they will go and buy them. So these aren't, at this point, the person who is asserting the patents, who is suing other companies or people, they are not the people who actually came up with that invention. And so there's a bit of a range there in terms of types of people who you'll see, but the term patent troll in particular, oftentimes, more often than not, is used to apply to the latter scenario.
Right. The bad guys there. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me maybe a little nitty gritty questions here, but how much does it cost, and how long is the process to work on getting a patent filed?
Sure, those are great questions, Ryan, and I'm going to be very precise with my language now, just so we're very clear. You first file a patent application, so you apply for a patent. You don't actually get a patent until the patent office decides to issue a patent based on your application. And so during the time between the filing of the application and the issuance of the granted patent, that period of time is called examination. And so that's when the patent office is taking a look at your application, the specification, the figures, and the claims, looking at the space of prior art out there. So they're doing their own searches based on the databases that they have access to. Sometimes they even go on the web and look for stuff. And they will review all the materials that they find and figure out whether or not they think that your claimed invention, based on the claims section in your patent application, describes something that is patentable, with eligible subject matter, and new and non-obvious over the entire space of what they're seeing with their search results. That process takes some time, and oftentimes you don't get the first indication from an examiner about whether or not what's their initial response to your patent application until anywhere from 18 months to 2 years after you file the application. At that point, on average, there are 2.5 office action cycles. And so the first time you hear from the patent office, you'll receive what's called an office action. That office action, on average, will reject your patent application based on the claims as filed. You have an opportunity at that point to try to overcome those rejections by amending your claims, and you can file a response to the patent office. They will then look at how you amended your claims, or if you simply provided arguments because you think the examiner is wrong in his rejection, you can also simply traverse his rejections and say, this is why I think you're wrong. And after he gets that response, he or she gets that response, they will then take a look at your response, look at the space of prior art again, and then either, if you're lucky, come up with a notice of allowance that they'll send out to you, or more typically, they'll issue another office action. That office action is then your next opportunity to really assess sort of the examiner's position, what the space of prior art is out there, whether or not it makes sense for you to amend your claims again and try again. On average, like I said, it takes 2.5 office action and response cycles before you get to the point where you know whether or not this is going to be allowed or whether you should consider just letting it go. This range can vary quite a bit. I've had some patent applications that took 6, 7, 8 years to get to an allowance for a number of different reasons. Once you get to a certain point during the examination process, if you have at least 2 office actions that you've received, you can also appeal the examiner's rejections. The appeals process goes to a different body, the Patent Trial and Appeal Board, and the appeals process can take quite a bit of time. They are working on bringing that time down at the Patent Office, but I've seen it in the past take anywhere from a year to 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years. So it can be a fairly lengthy process. That can add to the overall timeline. So I'd say that's kind of an outlier when you get to 6 years, 7 years for prosecution. But on average, it's probably right around 3 years or so from the date of filing until the date of issuance. Now, that's a lot of time. And every time you're asking your attorneys to handle an office action for you, you have to pay them for that time and effort to analyze the examiner's office action, figure out whether or not a response should be filed, and to advise you on whether or not they think you have a good chance of overcoming the examiner's rejections or not. Now, your attorney can never guarantee anything, and if you have a good attorney, they will never guarantee an allowance. But they should be able to provide you with their thoughts on potential strategies. So that's what we typically do is when we get an office action, we take a look at it, analyze it, and provide a recommendation to our clients about whether or not we think they should file a response, whether they should appeal, whether they should consider just abandoning the application. Sometimes we have to make those recommendations as well. But it's important to keep that entire cost and timeline in mind as you're deciding what to file patent applications on. Oftentimes, if you're an early stage startup, you don't have the money to file patent applications on everything that you might be doing. So it's really important to think about what are the high value inventions? What are the inventions that you truly think are new and different? That's where you want to really focus and invest your time and energy and money. And it's also important to think about, and this is where it's good to get advice from your investors as well, is what would have value if this company failed? What would the investor want to be left with as a portfolio of patents and or patent applications?
Yeah, it sounds like even if the patent were abandoned, even if you gave up on the process, there's still some pretty good value in going through that process and examining all that. It sounds like that 2 to 3 years of talking with your investors, talking with you. What are some of the side benefits of the process of examining your IP?
You will get a very good sense of what is out there and a very good sense of what is old, what is new, what has already been done, and who is doing what. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office offers what's called an assignment database. So typically, any company that has filed a patent application will have recorded proof of their ownership of that patent application. And you can see who those patent applications and patents are assigned to. So it's possible to get a sense of who else is innovating in this space. Now, the patents and patent applications are not published. They're not publicly available until 18 months after filing. And in addition, of course, the assignments information will not be publicly available until that time either. But once you get to a certain point, it provides a lot of really good strategic intelligence in order to understand what the space of the marketplace for innovation in that area is.
Nice. I know once a patent is approved, right, it's essentially approved by the U.S. Patent Office, right? Then there's this whole notion of how do you protect this internationally, right? How should a company think about, because it's not the same, it's not one approval covers you worldwide. So how do you advise around that? What's that process look like?
That's right, Brian. A U.S. patent is only good for blocking out your competitors within the U.S. It does not apply internationally. And in fact, internationally, when you look at the overall space, there are patent offices pretty much in every single country out there. And so those patents are only going to be good within those countries. This is why it's really important to do a really rigorous analysis when you're deciding whether or not to file an international patent application, either the broader one called the PCT application that has the ability to eventually provide a stepping stone to covering various different countries, or if you want to go straight to a patent application filing in one other country because you're very sure about where your future lies. Most startups are not that confident and that sure about where they will need international protection, especially as the space of industrial development evolves and certain countries become well known for semiconductor development or for software development or for different types of innovation. It's really hard to predict. So that's why one of the tools that's often recommended to our clients is something called the PCT application. PCT stands for Patent Cooperation Treaty. There are over 200 countries around the world that have signed on to this international treaty, and it basically enables you to file a single application that can then, within 30 months of the original priority date, you can then make a decision and push out that decision, which is very good for most startups that are just trying to find their feet and find their marketplace in the US. You can push out that decision point 30 months from that priority date and make the analysis later on about where you want to invest. Again, invest your time and your money and your energy into pursuing actual patent protection. So I'll let you know, most of my software clients, they're interested in countries that are doing a lot of software development. So they typically file in Europe. They may file in Asia, in certain countries in Asia. But they usually have a pretty good sense of the specific jurisdictions that they're interested in. With the PCT application, there is something called the World Intellectual Property Organization that will receive the PCT application and actually do some examination on the claims that are filed, and will also send you what's called a search report. So that search report is very similar to what's called an office action in the US, and it will let you know about the space of prior art that the examiner at WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, found when searching your patent claims, your patent application claims. Later on, the nice thing about that international search report is that you're not obligated to respond to it. You don't have to amend your claims at that time. You have the opportunity to push off that decision point again, meaning you save on that cost of responding to that international search report until you decide which countries. Maybe by the time you get to the 30-month point, hopefully not, but maybe your company has failed by then. And that way you didn't have to incur that cost of the attorney's fees earlier on to respond to that international search report. So oftentimes with startups, it's really the game of trying to push out risk, lengthen the timeline, give you enough runway to get to the point where you're a successful, viable business, and you have the money to invest and spend on these other important objectives. So the PCT is one application, is one way of doing that. In Europe, where a lot of our clients are interested in getting protection, either on the life sciences side or the software side, Europe has what's called the European Patent Office. As you know, the European Union involves a number of different countries. The European Patent Office covers some subset of that, but it is possible to file a patent application with the European Patent Office, go through the prosecution process at the EPO, and that way you can actually get to an allowance. So all examination can be completed through the EPO, and then at the end of that, you do have to validate your patent in the specific countries where you want to gain protection. And this is where we're going to come back to a discussion on costs, because once you get your patent issued, you still have to pay. You still have to pay what's called maintenance fees. So in the US, you pay maintenance fees at 3.5 years after issuance, at 7.5 years after issuance, and again at 11.5 years after issuance. So those fees are increasingly larger and larger amounts as you get further away from the issue date. And that's because there's the presumption that, as you're further away from the issue date, the patent probably has more value because the marketplace for your invention is probably more mature. There are more competitors potentially practicing your invention. The product marketplace is probably more well-developed. And so there's just a lot more money at stake. Aside from the US Patent and Trademark Office, every other patent office out there has its own maintenance fees. And so when you get your patent application allowed by the EPO, and then you're picking which European countries matter to you, you'll want to think about the fact that you will have to pay maintenance fees in each and every country that you validate your EPO allowed application in. So it's important to keep all of those various costs in mind. One thing that we do for our clients is that we'll provide them with an estimate ahead of time of all the various filing costs. The other big thing with international protection is that you do have to consider translation costs. So in order to file your patent application in China, you have to translate your entire patent application into Chinese. Same thing with Japan, same thing with a number of other countries. Luckily for the EPO, you can file your patent application in either English, French, or German and go through examination. And then later on, you may need to do a translation into other languages, depending on which countries you choose to validate in. But translation costs can often be a pretty costly part of filing internationally as well.
So ripped from the headlines, we're ending what we think is the light at the end of the tunnel and the pandemic. The U.S. has vaccines well in circulation. Headline recently talked about the Biden administration's support of waiving certain patents that pharmaceutical companies have in place to protect their work they've done on the COVID vaccines. What's going through your head right now as you read those headlines?
So thanks for that question, Trey. I'm going to be careful about responding to your question because we do have some clients who are in that space. But, I heard someone say on the radio that just because you have the cookbook to make some dish doesn't mean that you're going to be able to reproduce that dish. And the same is true for patented inventions. Oftentimes, although a patent may describe how to make an invention, it may not provide every single little detail that perhaps was discovered after the patent application was filed. Oftentimes, there's continual refinement of an invention, of a technology, that doesn't necessarily get incorporated into the patent application that was filed or even a subsequent one. And so if the process for making some vaccine was tweaked, it may be that the patent doesn't even describe the actual way that a company is using right now. In addition, it doesn't, just because you have the patent, does not mean that you have people with the technological know-how to actually do everything that's described in that patent to build what's required to run those manufacturing processes. There's a lot of additional technical know-how that goes into actually making those vaccines. And that would not be provided simply by licensing a patent, simply by allowing them to practice the invention. So there's just a lot that goes into being able to successfully not only manufacture, but distribute tons of vaccine shots. And, we saw that within our own country, distribution is a significant challenge to be solved on its own. Manufacturing is a significant challenge. Providing high quality input materials for that manufacturing process, all of that is, very, very important. Simply storing the final product in a manner that will preserve it until it can be administered. All of that is very important, and none of that is necessarily provided just by licensing a patent. So there's a lot that needs to be provided. I do think it's important to enable other countries to be able to vaccinate their populations. I just think there's a lot more that goes into it than just licensing the patents.
That's a great point. Very well put. As from someone who's messed up numerous recipes, it's not as simple as having access to the recipe for sure. And and there's much more at stake here.
More to it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's wrap. If one more question, I want to start doing this. We haven't done it in the past, but we've talked about very, very deep technical information here. we haven't asked about you. I want to start getting to know our guests a little better. Can I ask you just a question, friends, family, fun? What do you do when you're not thinking about patents, that sort of thing? So if that's okay to ask, I'll ask it now.
Sure.
Okay, great. Yeah.
So what do I do? I have family in the Bay Area. I spend a lot of time with my family, and I have a small dog. He is kind of my buddy and my companion, especially right now during shelter in place, working from home all the time. And let's see, what else? I guess you could say I'm a foodie, although some people cringe at that term, but I'm a big enthusiast of all types of cuisines, whether it's cooking or eating. I like to go on trips where the entire focus is on finding new types of foods to try out and restaurants to try. And, after law school, I went on a long post-bar exam trip, and it was 7 weeks spent driving through the countryside in 8 European countries in Western Europe, and just occasionally pulling over to go to a cheese cave or a winery or a mushroom farm or a fair, a country fair. Even the I have to say, even the gas station sandwiches in France are way better than the gas station sandwiches here. And I had a lot of really great meals, and it was an amazing trip. It was entirely food focused.
So you are a food hunter. But that's not all you hunt. Come on, you know what I'm getting at. You got to rotate the camera.
Okay, Trey. So I have, and I guess I might as well.
Yes, you have to. Yeah.
Show. So I have this guy on my on my home office wall, and I'm going to straight on the camera again there. But so that is a trophy-sized boar that I got on a hunting trip with some friends in Central California. I feel very, honored to have gotten the opportunity to find him and to bring him home. There are a whole lot of sausages and chops and steaks still in my freezer, and it's an amazing experience to really do the entire end-to-end experience in terms of how do you get your food. Personally, I feel a huge amount of respect for the boar, for other animals that I eat. I am an omnivore, and I love my meat. Yeah. But I have a lot of respect for the animals that I'm eating. I think it's really important to have that level of respect, and it really makes sure that you have a much more mindful approach to the consumption of meat. So.
I like that. That's good. Well, Hogene, thanks. We learned a lot. I learned a lot, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you taking the time and coming on and speaking with us. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me, Trey, Ryan. It's always a pleasure, and this was a lot of fun.
Thanks. Talk soon.
Bye.